Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe homeowners should have rights, not be bullied by power-hungry neighbors, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Buying the small property, just under 5 acres on the edge of what was still technically classified as a subdivision, felt like a dream come true. It had a modest but sturdy farmhouse, a couple of old outbuildings, and enough land to finally have the space I craved. I envisioned quiet mornings with coffee on the porch, the gentle sounds of nature, maybe a small vegetable garden, and the peaceful solitude that acreage affords. It wasn't a sprawling ranch, but it was mine, and it represented a fundamental shift towards a life less cluttered and controlled than the cramped city living I'd left behind. I meticulously reviewed the HOA documents before closing, as anyone should. They seemed typical for the most part: architectural review committee rules, lawn maintenance standards, fence guidelines. Nothing seemed overtly restrictive for a property of this size, especially considering its designation as one of the estate lots within the development, which historically had slightly different allowances. I moved in with optimism, eager to become a quiet, responsible member of this new community. I waved at neighbors, kept my modest lawn neatly trimmed around the house, and made plans for restoring the old barn. I wanted peace, and I was prepared to put in the effort to maintain it. But what she discovered next would force her to choose between keeping the peace and defending her property rights. My name is Sarah, and acquiring this property had been the culmination of years of saving and careful planning. It wasn't just a house, it was my sanctuary, a place where I could finally breathe and live on my own terms. The 5 acres were a mix of manicured lawn near the house and more natural, wooded areas towards the back property line. It felt expansive and private, a stark contrast to the postage stamp lots I'd seen elsewhere. I'd even researched local ordinances regarding small livestock, nurturing a quiet dream of getting a few chickens for fresh eggs eventually. Everything about the move was about creating a stable, peaceful life. The HOA, on paper, seemed benign. It covered common areas, enforced basic covenants like not leaving junk cars in your yard, and handled neighborhood events. The annual dues were reasonable. The board meetings I attended initially seemed straightforward, mostly discussing landscaping for the front entrance or coordinating the annual picnic. The president, a woman named Carol, was a ubiquitous presence, always organizing something, always chatting with neighbors. At first, her energy seemed positive, the mark of someone dedicated to the community. She lived on one of the smaller, interior lots, impeccably manicured, and seemed to know everyone's business. It wasn't until later that I realized her engagement wasn't about community spirit, it was about control. The first hint of overreach wasn't directed at me, but I observed it. A neighbor down the street received a rather aggressive letter about his mailbox post not matching the approved color palette, despite it being the same post that had been there for 20 years before he bought the house. Carol defended the citation at a board meeting, citing a minor update to the rules she had championed the previous year. It struck me as petty, but I dismissed it as an anomaly, perhaps a new rule being enforced a little too zealously. One evening, I was walking near the main entrance of the neighborhood and overheard Carol talking on her phone. She was complaining about these people who think they can just do whatever they want because they have a little land. She specifically mentioned wanting to rein in the properties on the estate side, muttering about messy trees and structures that don't fit. She sounded less like a community leader and more like a territorial monarch surveying her domain, planning annexations. It sent a small shiver down my spine, but I told myself I was being paranoid. My property was well maintained, and I intended to keep it that way. I had no messy trees, they were just trees, and the only structure was the old barn, which predated the HOA by decades and was explicitly grandfathered in the covenants. Still, the conversation lodged itself uncomfortably in my mind. The real shift, the moment peace began to curdle into conflict, started subtly. I had decided to put up a small, simple split-rail fence along a portion of my property line, mainly to demarcate the boundary and give a sense of enclosure without blocking the view. I submitted my application to the Architectural Review Committee, ARC, which Carol also chaired. The covenant specified split rail was an approved style for the estate lots. My application detailed the style, height, standard 4-foot, and location. It was a routine request. Weeks passed with no response, well past the 30-day window the covenant stipulated for the ARC to act. I called Carol to follow up. Her tone was immediately cool. "Oh, the fence application," she said, drawing out the words. "Yes, we're reviewing it. There are some concerns." Concerns? I asked, confused. The covenants list split rail as approved. It's standard height, standard style. Well, yes, but the location, she said vaguely. And the scale. It seems excessive for a residential property. Excessive? It's maybe 200 feet of fence, I replied. On 5 acres. It's hardly encircling a compound. We'll get back to you, she said, and the line went dead. This was the inciting incident. The unreasonable pushback on a minor, permitted project. My initial reaction was bewilderment. Why would she object to this? It was clearly allowed. I felt a prickle of frustration, then a wave of worry. Was this going to be difficult? I tried to maintain my composure, sending a polite follow-up email formally requesting a decision within the timeframe stipulated by the covenants, referencing the specific rule regarding ARC response time. I attached copies of the relevant covenant sections. I still hoped this was a misunderstanding, an oversight. I wanted to comply, to be a good neighbor, but I also wanted my fence. The day the formal denial arrived in my mailbox felt surreal. It was a curt letter, signed by Carol as ARC chair, stating the application was denied because the proposed fence location and extent do not align with the aesthetic standards of the community and represent an unapproved modification to the natural landscape. There was no mention of the covenant that listed split rail as approved. It felt arbitrary, personal. This was the point of no return. They weren't just enforcing rules. They were making them up or selectively applying them to prevent me from doing something explicitly allowed. The emotional impact was significant. Frustration turned to anger, and confusion solidified into suspicion. This wasn't about offense. It was about control. My initial attempt to comply by submitting the application and politely following up had been met with stonewalling and a nonsensical denial. It became clear that simply trying to be reasonable wasn't going to work. My first defensive action, beyond sending the polite email, was to photograph the location where I wanted the fence, gather copies of the HOA covenants again, and start a dedicated physical and digital folder titled HOA. I had a feeling I was going to need it. The tension escalated quickly after the fence denial. I politely but firmly replied to Carol's denial letter, citing the specific covenant section that approved split-rail fences on estate lots and noting that the ARC had exceeded the covenant-mandated response time, which in many jurisdictions rendered the request automatically approved. I requested reconsideration or a detailed explanation referencing specific violated covenants. I received no response. Then came the violation notices. They started small, almost laughably so. A notice about unapproved landscape materials, because I had a pile of compost near my vegetable garden area, tucked away behind the barn. A notice about excessive height of natural vegetation, because the wild blackberries were growing along the back fence line where my property bordered the woods. These were clearly retaliatory, fabricated issues. The covenants were silent on compost piles and certainly didn't regulate wild growth on the undeveloped parts of a 5-acre lot. I began documenting everything. Every notice received, dated and scanned. Every communication, whether email or notes from phone calls, though Carol increasingly avoided calls. I started taking photos daily, photos of my clean property, photos of other properties with actual covenant violations that were being ignored, junk cars, unapproved structures, overgrown yards on smaller lots, photos of the blackberry bushes, photos of the compost pile. I created a detailed log, noting dates, times, specific alleged violations, and how they violated the covenants by not being violations according to the rules. The frequency of the notices increased, and the tone became more aggressive. They started threatening fines, $50 a day for the compost pile, $75 a day for the blackberries. They warned of liens on my property if the fines weren't paid. This was procedural intimidation, using the threat of financial ruin to coerce compliance with made-up rules. Around this time, I decided professional help was necessary. I consulted a lawyer specializing in property law and HOA disputes. I brought my neatly organized folder, covenants, denial letter, violation notices, photos, communication logs. The lawyer reviewed everything, nodding. "This is classic overreach," she said. "Using fabricated violations and the threat of fines to enforce personal preferences or retaliate. The good news is, they're making a lot of mistakes. They're ignoring their own procedures, issuing fines without proper warning or due process, and trying to enforce rules that don't exist or don't apply to your property type." She explained my rights. The right to due process before fines, the right to a hearing, the right to rely on the written covenants, and the limitations of the HOA's authority, particularly concerning activities within the boundaries of a private property that weren't explicitly prohibited and didn't impact common areas or other neighbors. She advised me to continue documenting and to respond to every notice with a formal letter sent via certified mail, disputing the violation, citing the specific covenant section or lack thereof, and demanding a hearing. This was part of the strategic preparation, building a solid record of their procedural failures and my good faith attempts to resolve the issues through official channels. Carol, sensing I wasn't simply caving, increased the pressure. At a community meeting, she made thinly veiled comments about certain properties, lowering neighborhood standards and the importance of cooperation. Even when you don't like the rules, it was social pressure, trying to turn other neighbors against me. I remained quiet, observing, taking notes. I noticed a few sympathetic glances from other homeowners who had likely faced their own petty battles with Carol. The fake violations became more outlandish. A notice about unapproved livestock because a deer was seen eating apples under one of my trees. A notice about excessive noise from machinery because I used a standard lawnmower for 30 minutes. The sheer absurdity highlighted their desperation. Then came antagonist micro cameo 2, a direct confrontation. Carol cornered me as I was getting my mail. "Sarah," she said, her voice syrupy but her eyes hard. "We need to discuss all these issues with your property. The board is very concerned." "I've responded to the notices, Carol," I said calmly. "I've disputed them, citing the covenants. I'm following the proper procedure." "Following procedure?" She scoffed. "You're causing trouble. These aren't major issues. They could be cleared up if you would just comply. Get rid of the compost, trim the blackberries, stop whatever noisy activity you're doing. It's simple." "It's not simple when the violations aren't legitimate according to the covenants," I countered, keeping my voice low but firm. "The rules you're citing don't exist. And frankly, your attempts to dictate what I do within my own property boundaries are beyond the scope of the HOA's authority." Her face tightened. "The HOA is the authority here, Sarah. We set the standards. We maintain property values. People like you, who think they're above the rules because they have a little extra land, they damage the community. We can make things very difficult for you. Fines, liens, legal action. We have ways to ensure compliance." This was the moment she revealed her true colors, not a community volunteer, but a bully wielding perceived power, threatening financial ruin and legal battles to enforce her personal will. "Understood," I said, my resolve hardening completely. "And I have ways to ensure my property rights are protected according to the actual law, not your interpretation." I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, momentarily stunned by my lack of capitulation. The decision was made. I wasn't just defending myself. I was going to expose her abuse of power. The major turning point came not with a single discovery, but the cumulative weight of evidence combined with strategic legal advice. The smoking gun wasn't one item, but the pattern of procedural violations and fabricating rules. My lawyer had explained that HOAs derive their power from the recorded covenants and state law. They must follow their own rules for notification, hearings, and fining procedures. Carol's board had skipped steps, failed to provide hearings I'd requested via certified mail, and issued arbitrary fines. Each procedural misstep was a nail in her coffin. My lawyer advised me that while I could sue the HOA, a more direct route, given Carol's documented procedural errors and fabrication of violations, was to file official complaints with the relevant state agencies that oversee HOAs and consumer protection. These agencies had the power to investigate, mediate, and potentially impose penalties or require corrective actions, often more quickly and with less personal expense than a full lawsuit. Furthermore, the consistent pattern of harassment and baseless violations could potentially be construed as a form of civil harassment or even interference with quiet enjoyment of property, which were separate legal avenues. I spent weeks meticulously compiling my evidence package for the state complaint, chronologically organized violation notices, my certified letters disputing them and requesting hearings, with proof of delivery, photos dated and timestamped, the log of incidents, and the relevant sections of the covenants highlighting where the HOA had either ignored rules or invented new ones. I also included printouts of my initial, approved ARC application for the fence, noting its denial despite meeting covenant requirements, as evidence of the pattern of arbitrary decisions. While preparing this official complaint, I also quietly reached out to other neighbors I'd observed Carol clashing with or who had expressed sympathy. I shared my story, presenting the documented evidence. I discovered I wasn't alone. Several others had faced similar arbitrary demands, although most had grudgingly complied to avoid conflict. 2 other homeowners, however, had also pushed back and received similar fabricated violations and threats. We shared information, strengthening the case that this wasn't random enforcement, but a pattern of targeted harassment and abuse of power by Carol and her loyal board members. This confirmed my strategic advantage. I had not only legal leverage through Carol's procedural errors, but also potential community support and corroborating witnesses. Carol, meanwhile, seemed emboldened by my silence since our last confrontation. She likely interpreted my quiet preparation as surrender. She made a crucial mistake. She scheduled a special board meeting, ostensibly to address ongoing compliance issues with Lot 14, my property, but clearly intended as a public shaming and a move to officially levy huge, retroactive fines based on the fabricated violations. The notice for the meeting, however, was improperly posted, violating another HOA procedure requiring specific notice periods and posting locations for special meetings. Another procedural error documented. She was overconfident, rushing forward without her usual, minimal, adherence to rules, certain I would crumble under the pressure of public scrutiny and financial threats. She had no idea the legal weapon I had quietly forged. The climax wasn't a dramatic shouting match or a showy display, but the quiet, methodical execution of my strategy. I didn't attend Carol's improperly scheduled special meeting. Instead, the day before the meeting, my lawyer, acting on my behalf, filed the official complaint with the state agency, accompanied by the comprehensive evidence package. Simultaneously, she sent a formal legal letter, via certified mail and process server, to the entire HOA board, including Carol. This letter wasn't a negotiation, it was a statement of facts and intent. It detailed the pattern of harassment, the fabrication of violations, the systematic disregard for HOA covenants and procedures, listing specific instances and dates, and the pending complaint with the state agency, which was now initiating an investigation. It stated that I considered all violation notices issued since the fence denial to be invalid, all levied fines to be void, and demanded that the HOA cease and desist all further communication with me regarding these purported violations, directing any future correspondence through my legal counsel. It also included a demand for the approval of my original fence application, which was now automatically approved due to the ARC's failure to act within the mandated timeframe. The letter concluded by stating that I reserve the right to pursue further legal action, including seeking damages for harassment and the cost of legal representation, should the HOA fail to immediately rectify the situation and cease their unlawful conduct. The timing was everything. The letter and complaint landed just as Carol was preparing her public spectacle. News of the state complaint and the cease and desist letter spread quickly among the board members and, inevitably, through the neighborhood grapevine. Carol's shock and panic were palpable, even from a distance. The special meeting she called turned into a disaster. With the legal letter and state investigation hanging over them, other board members, who had previously deferred to Carol, suddenly became very interested in the procedural violations I had documented. They realized they were also liable for allowing her actions. The meeting quickly devolved from a planned attack on me into a frantic discussion about legal exposure and damage control. Carol reportedly tried to bluster and lie, claiming she had followed all procedures, but the dated, signed letters from my lawyer and the confirmation of the state complaint were undeniable. I maintained control by not engaging directly. I didn't attend the meeting. I didn't respond to frantic emails or calls from other board members. All communication went through my lawyer, who simply reiterated the points in her letter and stated we were cooperating fully with the state investigation. The truth was revealed publicly through the sheer force of the documented evidence and the official actions taken. The state agency's inquiry required the HOA to produce records, meeting minutes, violation notices, financial records related to fines, ARC applications, and correspondence. My meticulously kept records directly contradicted the HOA's incomplete or non-existent documentation of proper procedures. It became clear to the state investigator, and eventually to the wider community, that Carol had been acting with impunity, fabricating issues and ignoring the very rules she claimed to uphold. Carol's desperation tactics were pathetic. She reportedly tried to rally support by painting me as a litigious newcomer who wanted to destroy the neighborhood's harmony. but the evidence was too strong. The other board members were scrambling to distance themselves, fearing legal repercussions. Her closest allies on the board quietly resigned or sided against her. Her attempts at intimidation through gossip and social pressure backfired as neighbors learned the extent of her abuse and the validity of my stance. She was stripped of her authority not by a dramatic confrontation, but by the cold, hard facts of her own documented misconduct and procedural failures. The immediate aftermath was quiet. I was back on my property, a sense of calm settling over the fields and woods. The barrage of violation notices stopped abruptly. The threat of fines vanished. The legal victory was confirmed incrementally. The state agency found the HOA had violated several procedures and mishandled the fining process under Carol's leadership. They mandated corrective actions, including a review of all recent violation notices and a requirement for the board to undergo training on proper governance procedures. Carol, facing potential personal liability and the complete loss of trust from the other board members and the community, resigned as president and from the board entirely before the state concluded its full report. The other board members, eager to avoid further trouble, quickly approved my original fence application, retroactively acknowledging their error in the denial, and rescinded all fabricated violation notices and fines against my property. Carol faced the consequences of her power abuse alone. With her self-made authority gone, she was just another homeowner. The reputation she had built as the neighborhood's benevolent leader was replaced by the quiet understanding among residents that she had been a bully. She was rarely seen around the neighborhood after that, and her attempts to engage with neighbors were met with polite but firm distance. My life on the property returned to the peace I had originally sought, but with new, clearly defined boundaries. I put up my split-rail fence. I tended my compost pile and let the wild blackberries grow along the back. I knew my rights, I had documented my experiences, and I had demonstrated a willingness to defend my property within the bounds of the actual law. Standing on my porch, looking out at my 5 acres, I felt a deep sense of relief and hard-won self-respect. I hadn't caved to the pressure. I hadn't let a bully dictate how I lived on my own land. I had faced the challenge methodically, legally, and quietly, and I had prevailed. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more stories about standing up to HOA bullies.